afternoon and welcome to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Angelica Spanos. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We have several trials that we are following today and bringing those to you live, straight out of the courtrooms here on the Law and Crime Network. And joining us today for expert insight on these trials, we have Law and Crime legal analyst Elura Nanos. Hey there, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Angelica. Great to be here.
Great. So first, I want to talk about how yesterday we had Jane Doe number 2 on the stand. Jane Doe number 2 is a 59-year-old homeless woman who testified that Winslow raped her after picking her up in his car and offered to take her for coffee. She said he eventually made a U-turn, pulled over into the shoulder, took her out of his car and raped her. She says that Winslow said that if she screamed, he would kill her, and she said she had feared for her life. That was Jane Doe number 2, and she testified yesterday. Today we are waiting, but likely going to hear from the nurse who was examining her afterwards. And of course, it is still just 9 a.m. in California time, so the trial is set to start soon. But until then, let's talk about this here. What do you make of the testimony you've heard so far?
Well, I think that this testimony is going to have a massive effect on the jury in its cumulative nature. I mean, you have these two women so far, Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2. We had some very dramatic testimony where Jane Doe 1, I believe it was, it actually said she didn't want to look at the defendant, that it was too painful for her to do that. And what you have here is sort of the classic situation in criminal defense where you have prosecution witnesses who have issues. You know, they have credibility issues for a number of reasons. But at the same time, there's a very believable narrative about how they may have been victimized. So playing that game about what's going to hold more weight with the jury, the narrative of the crime or the sort of problems with the witness's credibility, that's really what we're going to see at play here. Which one of those competing things is going to outweigh the other?
Yeah, one of the interesting things I thought was how Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2's testimony was quite different from each other. Jane Doe 1 was a little bit more combative. She also was a little bit more confusing. She twisted her story a few times, whereas Jane Doe 2, her testimony was quite different. What do the jurors think when they hear, those two different types of testimonies?
Well, look, these are two different victims with two different incidents. So I think that a jury who's really paying attention can look at this and say, all right, well, we have this kind of garbled, scrambled story from this first victim, but then there are some obvious similarities between the alleged attack with victim 1 and victim 2. And, maybe victim, Jane Doe 1 was too garbled and scrambled to get that story out straight. But now we have kind of a second bite at the apple in a way, where now we have someone a little more coherent telling a story that's a little more consistent. I think that there is a very real possibility that the cumulative effect of having more than one woman telling a similar story but in different ways may actually kind of impact the different charges, even though obviously there are separate events. We may see kind of bleeding from one witness's story into the next. And you may have a jury that's kind of willing to excuse inconsistencies from one witness who's problematic when those inconsistencies are not there for a second witness in a second event.
And we talked about their differences, but also there are some similarities between the women. Jane Doe 1 is 54 years old. Jane Doe 2 is 59 years old. They made a point of mentioning that and talking about how they both are transient. What do you make of that?
So, it's funny that you bring that up, because when I first read about this case before the trial even started, that was the detail that stuck out for me more than any other, the age of the victims. So what we have here is a younger defendant allegedly assaulting older women. So these victims are transient or homeless women. And then some of the other charges relate to elderly women in their 80s, I believe. So that makes it unusual, because what we see more often than not in these cases is in sexual assault cases, we often see the victims being a similar age to the defendant or younger. It's unusual for the victims to be older. And what I think is emerging here, we can't really assume the facts being true or not true, but what we can look at that prosecution narrative and say, if these things actually, these accusations are true, there's a major similarity here and there's a pattern. And when we're talking sexual assault and we're talking patterns, that leads to guilty verdict.
Is it a possibility that they're maybe setting up some sort of MO or something like that?
Well, if we're talking about an MO, yeah. I mean, I think that is possible. The victims' kind of identities alone does not an MO make, because with an MO we're really talking more about how the defendant commits a crime, not necessarily who he commits it against. But in a very strict discussion of that. But if we're talking more about, who are the defendant's intended victims and how does he go about this? The narrative that I am seeing come out of what the prosecution is putting forth is this is a powerful man who is preying on the weakest of society, because even someone younger may have family members or neighbors or friends that are paying attention to their whereabouts. But if we're talking about older homeless women, those are the type of women that kind of tend to kind of eke in and out of society, have less accountability to people, less people around them, less support systems. So you put that together and you say, well, these are sort of perfect victims. And I think that statement is not going to be lost on the jury.
All right, Elura Nanos, thank you so much. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be following this trial live again out of California. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We are following the trial of Kellen Winslow II right now live in California. He's the former NFL player accused of 5 sex crimes against women. And right now we're watching live Jane Doe number 3 on the stand. She has accused Winslow of exposing himself to her while she was gardening. Her testimony has been going on here for almost about an hour now. She has a Vietnamese translator with her, and that in itself is pretty important. I want to bring in our law and crime legal analyst, Elura Nanos, with us right now. Elura, tell us, what is the impact of having this translator here in the courtroom?
Here is actually a bit different than the impact that translators can often have. Translators, by just the very logistics of the fact that they're hearing and then repeating and then hearing again and repeating, it sometimes can have the tendency to sort of sanitize testimony and remove the emotion from certain testimony. And in many cases in context, that actually makes the witness's testimony less impactful. But in this case, we're not seeing that at all. I think that what's happening here is that the translation function is actually making the witness's testimony even more credible, especially if you throw in the fact that without the translator, potentially she would have heavily accented English. What we're getting here is a very strict account of this woman's testimony. Her answers are very clear. They are very simple. And I think the result is that we're hearing a narrative here that is extremely easy to follow and extremely believable. And that narrative is of a tale of a woman who was totally minding her own business, gardening on her own property, interrupted by this guy who sexually harassed her in a way that completely took her off guard and scared the hell out of her. And I think that impact was 100% felt by this jury. And I think that the translator helped make it even more forceful of an impact.
All right. Well, we want to take you back live into the courtroom because I'm told we're going to hear the audio of a body camera that was worn by the deputy who took this report. So let's go back into that courtroom live. All right. So again, you're watching the live trial of Kellen Winslow II in California. On the stand right now, we have Jane Doe number 3 with a Vietnamese translator. Elura Nanos joining us here. You know, this is a great witness here, in my opinion. Tell us immediate reaction to what you've seen so far.
What I'm seeing here is really the perfect, most credible witness, because what we have is the body cam video, which, you know, she's more agitated, she's more emotional, which is what we would expect because it happened right at the time that this crime happened. But the significant details, what happened, how she knew it was this guy, what she observed, what she didn't observe, all of those things are entirely consistent with what she said here today in court. That makes her story very credible. And when you put it together with her explanations for things like why didn't she, identify him the right way, because she didn't look at his face, because culturally that's not what she did. All of it just weaves together a story that makes very good sense and is highly credible.
Absolutely. And you talked about those details. One of the things that we heard is she was asked about the street in which they lived on, which she said was Lake Drive. And that is indeed where Winslow's house is. It's currently on the market, but that was correct. We also heard her recognizing the tattoos and talking about his large tattoo on his arm.
Exactly. And he has a tattoo on his arm. That tattoo it's kind of nondescript. It's it's kind of like a vague design. It's a very large tattoo. So her answer is exactly what you would expect. They said, can you describe the tattoo? And she kind of said, not really. I can't really describe it. I can just say that there was a tattoo. And when you see a photo of it, her testimony made perfect sense given what his tattoos actually look like. I haven't seen a single point here that is even remotely inconsistent. And I think for that reason, this witness is going to be very believable to a jury.
And one of the other things that stuck out to me was talking about the timeline of all of this. She was able to really get the nitty-gritty details here. And with that body cam video, it confirmed all of that. How does a piece of evidence like that body cam video play into this?
Well, it would play into it sort of more if somehow it conflicted with what she said now. So, if she said something then and she has a different story now, that's going to be major fodder for cross-examination. It's going to go to her credibility. But in this case, she told the story now, and then she basically told the same story before, but was a lot more agitated when she told it before. And I think all of that just comes together to paint a very reasonable picture of a woman who was on her own property, minding her own business, and was approached in a way that she found highly offensive, that anyone would certainly find equally highly offensive, and that it just completely caught her off guard by surprise. And that really was the feeling that I left with after watching this, to say, this is not an issue, as with some of the other witnesses, about whether the interaction may have been consensual or not. This was a woman who was completely minding her own business and was essentially attacked in a way, although she wasn't touched, but was just assaulted by someone riding by on a bicycle. And her immediate reaction was to say, no, go away. I'm going to call my husband, go away, and call the police, which is, from a prosecutor's standpoint, really the best thing that we could ever hope for with a witness.
All right, Elura Nanos, thank you so much. We have to take a quick break, but stay with us. We'll have more live testimony when we come back.